On October 19, 1973, President Richard Nixon asked the United States Congress to approve $2.2 billion in emergency military aid for Israel. On October 20th, Saudi Arabia announced a total embargo on oil exports to the United States, soon joined by other Arab producers. Within weeks, the price of oil had begun a rise that would take it from around $3 a barrel to nearly $12, a fourfold increase in a matter of months. Petrol stations across the United States ran dry. Queues stretched for miles, speed limits were cut, heating fuel shortages occurred in parts of the country. The United States economy was thrown into one of the most severe economic disruptions of the post-war era, triggered by decisions taken at emergency meetings of Arab oil producers. It was the first large-scale use of oil as a geopolitical weapon against the industrialized West, and almost nothing about the Western response to it went as planned. To understand why the 1973 embargo hit so hard, you have to understand how completely the post-war Western economy had been built on cheap oil. In the decades after the Second World War, oil was extraordinarily cheap, kept that way by a combination of abundant American production, the enormous reserves of the Persian Gulf, and the pricing power of the Western oil companies that had dominated Middle Eastern production since the early 20th century. Cheap oil made possible the suburban expansion of American cities, the growth of the automobile industry, the spread of aviation, the development of petrochemical industries that produce plastics, fertilizers, and synthetic materials. The entire architecture of post-war prosperity was built on the assumption that oil would remain cheap and plentiful. By 1973, the United States was consuming roughly a third of all the oil produced in the world. American domestic production had peaked in 1970 and was beginning to decline. The gap between domestic production and consumption was increasingly filled by imports, and a growing share of those imports came from the Arab members of OPEC. The vulnerability had been building for years. Almost nobody in Washington had taken it seriously. The immediate trigger for the embargo was the Yom Kippur War, a conflict that began on October 6, 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat had been trying for years to recover the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured in the 1967 Six-Day War. Diplomatic approaches had failed. Sadat concluded that only a military shock could force the United States to pressure Israel into negotiations. He planned the attack carefully, choosing the date of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, to maximize the element of surprise. The attack initially succeeded. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and established positions on the eastern bank. Syrian forces advanced on the Golan Heights. Israel, caught off guard, suffered significant early losses. As the fighting turned against the Arab coalition, Israeli forces recovered and began pushing back. The United States launched a major military airlift to resupply Israel. On October 19, Nixon requested the $2.2 billion emergency aid package from Congress. It was this decision, the public large-scale American commitment to Israel's military position, that triggered the collective Arab response. Saudi Arabia, under King Faisal, had been warning American officials for months that continued unconditional support for Israel would have consequences. Kissinger had underestimated the likelihood that the producers would actually impose an embargo. On October 20th, Saudi Arabia announced it was joining the embargo. The other Arab oil producers followed. The embargo targeted the United States, the Netherlands, Portugal, Rhodesia, South Africa, and later other countries deemed to have supported Israel. It was not a production cut alone. It was a complete ban on oil exports to the targeted nations, combined with production cuts that tightened global supply. The effects were immediate and severe. In the United States, the combination of the embargo and Nixon's existing domestic price controls created chaos. Because the government had capped domestic oil prices below market rates, there was no price signal to reduce consumption. Americans continued to demand oil at controlled prices even as supply collapsed. The result was physical shortages. Petrol stations ran out of fuel, queues formed before dawn, and the government introduced odd-even rationing, allowing drivers to fill up only on alternate days based on their number plates. The economic damage extended far beyond the petrol queue. Industries dependent on cheap energy, airlines, automobile manufacturers, chemical companies, saw costs surge. Inflation accelerated. The American economy entered a period of stagflation, simultaneous inflation and economic stagnation that would persist for the rest of the decade. Europe was similarly affected. The Netherlands, targeted specifically because of its support for Israel and its role as a major oil transit hub, faced particularly acute shortages. Britain and France, which had tried to stay neutral in the Arab-Israeli conflict precisely to protect their oil supplies, found that neutrality provided only partial insulation. Japan, which imported almost all of its oil and had no significant domestic production, was acutely vulnerable. Japanese officials publicly distanced their government from American Middle East policy in ways that alarmed Washington but reflected the desperate reality of Japan's energy dependence. The Nixon administration's response to the embargo was a combination of diplomacy, domestic policy adjustment, and the beginning of a longer-term strategic rethink of American energy policy. Kissinger conducted intensive shuttle diplomacy, traveling repeatedly between Arab capitals, Tel Aviv, and Washington, to negotiate the disengagement agreements between Israel and its Arab neighbors that provided the diplomatic cover for lifting the embargo. The Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreement was signed in January 1974. In March 1974, OPEC lifted the embargo against the United States. But the price of oil did not come back down. The embargo had demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated, that the Arab oil producers had the power to set the price of a commodity on which the entire Western economy depended, and that they were willing to use that power for political ends. The oil companies' pricing power, which had kept oil cheap for decades, had been broken. Nixon launched Project Independence, an ambitious program to make the United States energy independent by 1980, through domestic production increases, conservation, and alternative energy development. It largely failed in its immediate goals. But it marked the beginning of a permanent shift in how the United States thought about energy security. The International Energy Agency was created in 1974, partly as a direct response to the embargo, a mechanism for Western industrialized nations to coordinate their response to future supply disruptions and build strategic reserves. The consequences of the 1973 oil shock extended far beyond the immediate crisis. In the oil-producing world, the embargo transferred enormous wealth from the consuming nations to the producers. The revenues that flowed into Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and other Gulf states in the years after 1973 funded the transformation of those economies and societies, the construction of modern cities, the development of state institutions, the growth of sovereign wealth funds, and the geopolitical influence that Gulf states exercise today. In the consuming world, the shock forced a fundamental rethinking of energy policy. Conservation measures that seemed radical in 1973, fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, building insulation requirements, investment in nuclear and other alternative energy sources, became permanent features of Western economic policy. The 55 miles per hour speed limit introduced in the United States in 1974 remained in place until 1995. Most consequentially, the embargo demonstrated that the old order of Western dominance over global energy markets had ended. The era of cheap oil that had powered post-war prosperity was over. The era of energy geopolitics, in which the relationship between consuming and producing nations would be defined by competition, dependency, and recurring crisis, had begun. That era has not ended. Many subsequent geopolitical conflicts involving oil, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Gulf War of 1991, the Iraq War of 2003, the debates over energy transition today, have their roots in the demonstration of October 1973 that oil was not merely a commodity but a weapon, and that those who controlled its supply controlled something more fundamental than just a market. The 1973 oil embargo lasted 5 months. In those 5 months, it reshuffled the global economic order, ended the era of cheap energy, created the modern energy security infrastructure, transferred hundreds of billions of dollars from consuming to producing nations, and demonstrated permanently that the industrialized world's dependence on imported oil was a strategic vulnerability of the First Order. It was triggered by a $2.2 billion military aid request that Nixon sent to Congress on a Thursday afternoon in October. The weapon nobody had taken seriously had been used, and the world it created is the world we still live in.